Welcome everyone to this week's video lecture for History 1306, or U.S. history after 1877. The topic for this week is going to be World War I and some domestic issues that are happening in the teens and the turbulent 20s, as they call it in American history. So there's a lot to cover here, and we're just going to dive right in. When we talk about World War I, the origins of World War I all start with imperialism, nationalism, and imperial alliances. In a lot of ways, it's difficult to understand if you're not familiar with the broader global context of what's going on in the early 20th century. It's hard to understand how a small conflict in Central Europe would blow up into a global, worldwide sort of problem, and what they called the Great War or the First World War. And all of this comes back to nationalists when we look at World War I. These are people who are living under an imperial control. So in other words, this is a time period when Europe has gone out and taken large swaths of territory in Southeast Asia. They've taken large swaths of territory, pretty much the entire continent of Africa. As we saw in previous lectures, they pretty much sat down at a meeting and divided Africa up amongst themselves. So when you do this and you impose that kind of political control on another group of people, naturally they're not happy. And this breeds nationalism and nationalists. Now, I know that this word gets thrown a lot now in the context of modern politics, but that's not what we're really talking about. Nationalists are people who are specifically fighting to get rid of colonial influence in their land. They're basically living in an imperial society. They're living in colonies, and they're basically going to be demanding that whatever country is running the colony leaves and gives those people independence. And that's what a lot of the origins of World War I are all about. It's rooted in a nationalist movement, in particular in the Yugoslavian nationalist movement, which I'm sure most of you probably aren't familiar with. But Yugoslavia was the country back when I was younger. I'll just put it that way. It existed up until the early 1990s, just on the borders of Austria, Hungary, and that area of Central Europe. So what we're looking at here is the main sort of player in the outbreak of this war is the that's an old term. They call it the Austria-Hungarian Empire. This empire had expanded in Central Europe. They weren't an overseas sort of imperial power. Austria-Hungary didn't go down to Africa and get a whole bunch of land. They didn't get land in the southeast region of Asia. They didn't get any land in the Pacific. This is not an overseas sort of empire, but it is a land-based empire right there in Central Europe. And they had spread out in that region and ultimately had taken over the area that today we call Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, since 1879, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire had been in an alliance with the German Empire. Now, this is important because the German Empire is much more powerful. They're much larger. They have gone overseas. They hold German Cameroon. They hold Southwest, what at the time they called German Southwest Africa. Today we would call that area Namibia. But basically, the Germans are a major global imperial power. And so when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire joins up with Germany, they're really doing it because they kind of need like a big brother to watch out for them on the playground. Germany's really the teeth of this alliance. If someone were to upset Austria-Hungary, it would kind of be like, sorry about that. But if you upset Germany, you're going to pay for it. And so when we look at the what they call the Central Powers, and this is going to be one side of World War I's conflict, this is where the alliance starts. It starts between Austria and Hungary and Germany. But if you look just a little bit south of those areas in Central Europe, you've got a big boot hanging down in the Mediterranean that feels kind of left out. And so Italy is actually going to look at these two other nations right around them and these empires, and they're going to say, well, we want to be part of the alliance too. And so they are going to form a triple alliance, and so this partnership between Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, they will become the core of what we call the Central Powers. And so as you're already starting to see, this has a lot to do with imperialism and then also imperial alliances. Now, on the other side of World War I, you have the Allied powers. This is a term that will be used again. You might be more familiar with it in the context of World War II. But the Allied powers are going to be made up of Russia and the British Empire, and then eventually France is going to get involved in it as well. So, to look at the origins of this alliance, or the Allied powers, we have to go back into imperial history. Between 1830 and 1895, Russia and Britain are at each other's throats. They're at almost constant warfare. They're fighting with local armies and one another to try to get control of the tribal mountainous regions of Afghanistan. Now, this might seem like it's a world away from the area that we're talking about and the conflict that we're going to be looking at in World War I. But in the process of trying to take Afghanistan, which is something that they called the Great Game, it's basically Britain has all of India and what today we would call Pakistan, whereas Russia has grown down from the north and come right up to the borders of Afghanistan. So Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan, is sort of wedged in between the Russian Empire in the north and the British Empire in control of India and Pakistan on the south. So they fought for decades over this territory. In the end, Britain would accept that Russia got control of Afghanistan, and then the rest of it would remain British India. And so they came to this agreement, and they said, all right, it's not worth fighting over Afghanistan anymore. Russia can take it. And so once this whole problem kind of goes away, the British Empire and the Russian empires don't really have any problems anymore. So they basically are going to become friends after the Great Game. So in 1907, the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and the French Empire signed into what they called the Entente Alliance. And this would form the basis of what we call the Allied powers. So more or less, the Central powers are going to form up first. And so what's happening here is Britain and Russia, have kind of put their differences aside. They're looking at this partnership and they say, well, all of Central Europe, the Central powers, have aligned together, and they have this three-state alliance between Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Germany. So in order to protect themselves from this alliance, Russia, Britain, and France all signed into the Entente Alliance in 1907. And so this will function as a counterweight to the Central Powers alliances. Now, you're probably getting sick of me saying alliance and imperial power and this and that, but this is really what World War I is all about. Here's the deal. What does somebody living in Nigeria care about what happens in Europe? They don't. What does somebody in India care about what happens in Sarajevo and what today we would call Bosnia-Herzegovina? They don't. But when you're a colony living under an imperial power, when the imperial power goes to war, you go to war. And that's the reality. So when Britain decides, that's it, we're going to enter into this war, their colonists in India have to pick up rifles, go overseas and fight. There are colonists in Nigeria. There are colonists in Kenya, all these different areas. In fact, one of the most famous regiments to fight in the world wars is known as the King's African Rifles. And so what we're seeing here is that this move to go to war when you're an imperial power is basically going to drag a huge swath of the world with them. The people in the colonized territories don't care, but they don't have a choice. They're being forced to go to war. So everybody is kind of set up in this imperial scheme where they have all these overseas territories, or they're growing in terms of land empires. Now, Montenegro and Serbia, they are both on the border of Austria-Hungary, and they're allies with Russia. And this, I know that this, again, if you're in a U.S. history class, you're probably going enough with the European history stuff. But what's happening here is Montenegro and Serbia are both Slavic nations. They speak Slavic languages. They identify as Slavic people. They're what they call Southern Slavs. And when you translate the word Yugoslavia, which is what they're fighting for here, it means Southern Slavic nation. So what these individuals who are Slavic are experiencing is they've had Germanic people, the Austrian-Hungarian people are Germanic. They came in and conquered this basically Slavic-speaking territory. Now, that's not a huge deal either. It's not like Serbia or Montenegro could do anything about this. But they've got a buddy over in Russia, because the Russians are Slavic as well. So it's not just about imperial alliances here building into World War I, but there's also an element of ethnic alliances. When the Austrian and Hungarians get together, it's because Austrian, Hungarian, and Germans, it's because their ruling class is Germanic. They are way, way, way more closely related to people in Germany than they are to people in Hungary, the ruling class of that empire. And so, what happens is, when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire grows outwards into this region of modern-day Bosnia-Herzegovina, out into Serbia, out into Montenegro, they are basically threatening Slavic people, and that is going to put them on a collision course with Russia. Russia is not going to let other Slavic people be conquered and dominated by Germanic people. And so this is where the origins of the Allied powers and these sort of imperial alliances rest when we look at the sort of precursors to World War I. So I realize I've been dancing around the point a little bit, and we're going to get right now to the event that starts or sparks World War I, and that is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So there's this guy named Gavrilo Princip. He's working alongside 6 other Bosnian and Serbian nationalists in an organization that's known as the Black Hand. Now, their goal is to assassinate Franz Ferdinand, who is the Archduke, or basically he's kind of, at this point, to give you a neater corollary, he's kind of like a prince of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. They hope that by killing him, that the Austrian-Hungarian Empire would get the message, and they would pull back from Bosnia. They pull back from Serbia and Herzegovina, so that all these southern Slavic states could organize into an independent country that they want to call Yugoslavia. So, in 1914, Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are in the city of Sarajevo on official business. And essentially, the Black Hand is going to make a first attempt to assassinate them. It doesn't work. It fails. They throw a bomb at his car, but it bounces off of his bumper and rolls under the car behind him, and it blows up the car behind Franz Ferdinand, not him or his wife or the car they were really targeting. So despite the fact that somebody had already tried to kill him that day, Ferdinand and Sophie actually, in a sort of a goodwill mission, they decide to go to the hospital where the people who are recovering from the first attempt, who got hurt in the explosion, they're there getting treated. And so Ferdinand and Sophie go there to visit the victims of that first bombing attempt. When they're leaving a speech just outside the hospital that's being given by the mayor of Sarajevo, their car kind of gets stuck in a crowd, and they need to basically do like a 3-point turn, and turn back and turn around. When the car does that, it actually stops right in front of this guy, Gavrilo Princip, a member of the Black Hand. He sees an opportunity, and he pulls out a handgun and fires twice into the vehicle. And he hits Franz Ferdinand in the neck, and he hits Sophie in the abdomen. They are both going to die on their way to receiving treatment. So, Black Hand has achieved their goal in killing Franz Ferdinand, but what they didn't do is really meet this stated goal of getting the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to leave the territory. In fact, this is going to have the exact opposite effect here. Princip is going to be immediately arrested. They grab him right in the street. The other members of the Black Hand that are in Austria or Hungary and within the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, they're all going to be rounded up and arrested. Some of the other members actually escape over to Serbia, but they're going to later be arrested and tried for the assassination as well. Now, the murder of Ferdinand and Sophie is going to lead to massive anti-Serbian protests because the supporters of Austria-Hungary are convinced that this wasn't a plot by a bunch of just simply Yugoslavian nationalists that are operating in Sarajevo. They think this is a bigger plot that was being sort of masterminded by Serbia, which is a larger independent country. So there were anti-Serbian pogroms in Sarajevo and well beyond. All over the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, there is a lot of animosity towards anybody who is Serbian in terms of their background. And now the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the first thing that they're going to do is they call their buddies in Germany, and they say, it's time to honor that alliance. And both countries are going to demand that Serbia open up an investigation into this plot. They send a letter to the Serbian government, both Germany and Austria-Hungary, and this letter is known as the July Ultimatum. This is being sent in 1914, the same year. Basically what the July Ultimatum says is, you're going to open up your country and your borders. We're going to bring the military in. We're going to conduct the investigation. You're going to sit on the sidelines and do what we tell you to do. Long story short, it's not the type of letter that another independent nation, is going to receive very well. So immediately Serbia just goes, forget this, and they throw the letter in the trash. Serbia is basically they're being asked to give up their autonomy and their sort of sovereignty in all of this. So, in response to them not following the July ultimatum, Austria-Hungary and Serbia both moved troops right to the border between the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and Serbia. And almost immediately skirmishes start breaking out between the two. So now, because of this problem here in Central Europe, Austria-Hungary and Serbia are now at war. Russia is an ally of that Slavic state of Serbia. So they pretty quickly see what's going on and they say, well, now we've got to honor our alliance with Serbia. And they get involved with the explicit directive to help Serbia repel this Germanic threat from Austria-Hungary and Germany combined. Now, as a condition of that Entente alliance, once Russia gets involved, now France and Britain are obligated to enter into this big brouhaha that's building up in Central Europe. And so the Central Alliance is going to mobilize on July 28th, 1914. That's when Germany moves their troops down to the border to help Austria-Hungary. And then Italy actually kind of drags their feet a little bit. We're going to talk about Italy in a minute. They don't stay in this alliance for very long. But now, both the Triple Alliance of the Central Powers has been triggered, the Triple Alliance of the Allied Powers have been triggered, and now the largest sort of global powers, imperial powers in the world, have declared war on one another. And the major powers of Europe have declared war on one another. And so this is how World War comes to a head and begins. So, when we look at the alliances, as I mentioned, they change pretty quickly. In August of 1915, Japan is going to enter into the conflict on the side of the Allies. This is mostly because they enjoyed a better trade relationship with the nations of Western Europe than the nations of Central Europe. And so Japan enters into this conflict, and there's a bigger motivation here. Japan is in direct competition with Germany. Germany had been sailing around the Pacific, snatching up little islands like the Marianas Islands and the Solomon Islands, those areas. So Germany is going and grabbing those up, and Japan is doing the same thing. Japan is a Pacific power. They're expanding. They're an imperial power. So they're actually start reaching out. They're trying to take these islands too. So when the war breaks out, Japan sees an opportunity. They see an area to attack Germany and have it, get a little help from other powers around the world. So that's their whole goal in entering the war, is weakening Germany. In 1915, Italy is going to leave the Central Alliance and join the Allied powers. More or less what Italy says is, look, Serbia didn't start this war, you started this war. By sending the July ultimatum, you put yourself in a position where you wanted to pick a fight with the Serbians. You wanted a war to start. And we're not comfortable going and defending you and joining up in your alliance if you're going to go picking fights with people all over the place. So then Italy is going to leave the Central Alliance and join the Allied powers. In 1916, Portugal and Romania are going to enter the war on the side of the Allies as well. Now, there is a nation here that you might be wondering what's going on with them, a major power in Western Europe, and that is Spain. Spain, throughout both world wars, is dealing with internal schisms. They have big problems in their own national government. They do get involved in these wars. They do take sides in these wars. But they don't ever officially join into either side. They're going to be kind of fighting. The world wars kind of spill into Spain and take their own shape in that nation. They kind of get tagged on to already existing conflicts in Spain. But otherwise, you have most of Western Europe is essentially in this war, and then a few powers in Eastern Europe as well, like with Romania and Russia, obviously. So, on the Central Powers side, Belgium and Luxembourg are going to be invaded right at the outset of the war. And again, you can see some parallels in both world wars. This happens again in World War II. Basically, Belgium and Luxembourg are tiny little countries on the northern border of Germany, and Germany's just going to basically waltz in and take over that. So ultimately, right at the outset of the war, Germany takes over Belgium and Luxembourg, and they're informally now part of the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire will publicly join the Central Powers in October of 1914. This is because of a major trade relationship between Germany and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire controls most of the Middle East and parts of North Africa, parts of the Arabian Peninsula at this point. But what you should know is that this is an empire that's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And actually, at the time when World War I breaks out in 1914, the Ottoman Empire is declining, shrinking, and getting weaker. But they are going to realize that if they want to have a bright future, they need to ensure that Germany wins and can keep this trade relationship open. So there's something called the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, and that's where most of the trade is being conducted over this railroad track. So they're going to join up with Germany and become part of the Central Powers. As a spoiler alert, the Ottoman Empire will not survive this conflict. World War I will bring an end to the Ottoman Empire. So Bulgaria also had a military alliance with the Ottoman Empire. And they were still pretty bitter from being defeated by, I guess you could call it a confederation of Slavic states in a 1913 conflict. So they're kind of bitter at the Slavic states, and they are aligned with the Ottoman Empire militarily. So for Bulgaria, it's a pretty easy decision as to how they're going to join up in this war. And to be very honest with you, Bulgaria doesn't factor in a whole lot when we look at the outcome of World War I. So we're going to look at some early patterns of warfare here. And the best way you can kind of describe the outset of World War I is that there is a lot of confusion amongst the Central Powers. Though Germany is the major military, they're the linchpin. They're the most powerful nation in this alliance by far and away. Nobody's even close to them. But Germany makes this assumption that they're going to be fighting Britain and France over on the Western Front. That would be the border between France and Germany, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and Germany as well. So you've got all these areas there. Germany's idea is that we're going to be fighting over here. That's where all the major military powers are, except for Russia. And so their assumption also is that Austria-Hungary is going to fight the Russians on the Eastern Front. The Germans have a pretty good game plan, actually. They carry through something called the Schlieffen Plan. And this was their goal of invading France. And this is how they figured out how they're going to do it. And again, in a parallel, this is something that you'll see happen again in World War II. This happens whenever Germany attacks France. France lines all its troops and resources up at the border to try and defend the borderland. Germany says, rather than just constantly trying to push them back from the border, here's what we do. We punch a hole in their defenses. We rip this hole wide open, we march our troops in through the hole, and now we're fighting from within the country and pushing them out. And that's what the Schlieffen Plan is going to refer to. When they go ahead and attack France, though, when they invade France in World War I in 1914, that draws Great Britain directly into the war. Great Britain starts landing troops in the parts of northern France and western France. They start bringing over troops and boats, and they are going to directly enter this conflict as well. So that was the game plan. And if everybody had stuck to it, Germany would have been pretty pleased about that. But Austria-Hungary doesn't do what they are supposed to do. The Serbians are not the problem here militarily. The Serbians could easily be rolled over by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But that's not the game plan. And what Austria-Hungary ends up having to do is they are so pissed off at Serbia, they just go and attack Serbia right away. And they put most of their resources down on the southern border with Serbia. And so that leaves them split between South and East. And the most powerful army in that area of the world is going to be the Russian army marching in from the East. And so Austria-Hungary has kind of screwed up the entire Central Powers game plan. The Germans are then going to be, instead of being able to just focus on the Western Front, they have to split their resources in half too. And they go over and have to help Austria-Hungary against the Russians in the East. So ultimately, both sides of this conflict realize their tactics are completely out of date with the development of new military technologies. So this is one of the first wars in which, and you could make the argument that actually the sort of dry run for World War I was the colonial period in Africa. Particularly the Germans, they tried out a lot of their military technology, putting down rebellions in East and West Africa. So they are now using this new technology. This is one of the first wide-scale wars in which we see automatic weaponry, where they're basically having these big automatic machine guns that can just blow holes through an entire army. And generally, the Germans are going to be using something known as a howitzer. The Americans and the British call it a Gatling gun. But this basically, you've seen one. It's a circular gun that spins round and round. It's got a bunch of different barrels in it. Back in these days, you just turn a hand crank and this thing goes around just firing these massively high powered bullets out of the gun. So these are the types of things that have developed. And we have biological warfare. People are starting to use mustard gas. All these things start to emerge really quickly. And that's why they call this, in its time period, the people witnessing this called this the war to end all wars. They thought this was the most horrific conflict in world history up to that point. And truly it was. So you start to see different types of warfare. If your opponent's got a big gun that can just mow down a whole line full of guys, no longer are we going to see European battles with two powers lining up from one another and then marching at each other like this, shooting. Everybody would be dead real quick. So that's not how they're going to do it. Instead, they start digging trenches. If I could fire a gun on a straight line and pick everyone off, then the solution to that is to get down and hide under the ground. And that's why they start digging trenches. But people are ingenious killers. And so they say, all right, you're going to hide in a trench. I've got a solution for that. If I throw a grenade into the trench, I blow up one section of it, presumably kill about 3 or 4 people. That's good. But you know what's better? If I have a bunch of people sitting in a trench, why don't I lob a grenade in there that releases poisonous gas? And so here we see the usage of mustard gas, biological warfare. They're going to say, if you hide in the trench, I'm going to throw a gas into the trench that forces you to come up because you can't sit in there and breathe that stuff in. So they come up, and then I pick them off. And so people start developing gas masks to try and deal with that. The trenches are not just for people hiding in. This is also one of the first wars in which we see the wide-scale usage of tanks. A tank has a hard time driving in over a ditch. But the tanks are going to move from, originally they were just armored vehicles with wheels, but that's when they start to get the tread pattern that we're familiar with, because they start rolling over these trenches. If I'm just rolling on a tread, I go right over the trench. I don't fall into it. I just keep going. But if I had wheels, my front wheels fall in, then my back end lifts up. So what you can see here is that all of these things, the war is going to be quite a bit different from anything anybody had ever seen. In addition to all this, you're going to see that this is the first wide-scale conflict in which anybody uses dogfighting or aviation as a way of fighting the war. This will be the first time that we see planes on both sides of the conflict flying up there and attacking each other. So naval warfare becomes critical in the Pacific. Japan lashes immediately out and starts striking at all of the German colonial forces there in the Pacific. And in the Atlantic, the German activities, what they're doing in the Atlantic Ocean, is what's going to ultimately draw the United States into World War I. And I promise you, we are going to get to the subject of the United States in World War I. But the United States doesn't want to get involved in this. Initially, when Americans look at this thing at World War I, they look at it and they say, it's a European conflict. It's not our problem. And really, when they witness this war, they look at it as sort of a continuation of what's always happened in Europe. The American opinion of Europe is that they've been killing each other for centuries over the stupidest minor stuff. So when these powers start fighting each other, Americans kind of go, that's what Europeans do. Not a big deal. So Woodrow Wilson, who is then the president of the United States, is going to push the people to remain impartial in thought as well as in action. In other words, the official position of the United States in World War I, when it breaks out, is neutrality. We don't want to get involved. It's not our business what they're fighting about over there. Now, that's a difficult position to define, though, because we're talking about a globalized world with interrelated trade routes, trade relationships. And this is they have to start answering some serious questions about what does it mean to be neutral. If you're neutral, do you still do business with people on both sides? And if you're doing business with them, should you be selling them weapons that they're using to kill your other business partner? In addition to that, can Americans continue traveling abroad? Can we get on boats and go over to Europe and go sightseeing and do all that? These are the types of questions that Americans are trying to answer. Can we continue on with our day-to-day lives and just do what we need to do as long as you guys are fighting. Is that, that's not our problem. And so we're trying to figure out, how do you be neutral but still engage with both sides of the conflict? So Wilson and his Secretary of State, a guy by the name of William Jennings Bryan, initially their game plan is, look, we can't give loans to anybody fighting in this war. What America really wants is, they want this war over quick. We're losing money. That's about all it means to the United States at the outset. Is our trade partners are basically pushing all their resources towards the war effort, and we're sitting there trying to essentially say, stop fighting. We just want to resume doing business with you all. So by 1915, the Allied powers were going pretty much broke fighting this war. Germany had really driven hard into France, and France, their military was not particularly capable. They weren't in a good position at this time. They had far more resources in their overseas colonies than they actually had in Europe. So Britain is actually going to be the one doing most of the fighting for France throughout the remainder of the war. They're the ones fighting over France with the Germans. And Wilson is looking at this, and he says, Woodrow Wilson goes, look, if this continues on, we're going to have a recession in the United States. Europe, if they can't buy our goods anymore, we're just going to go broke. And so they get rid of that idea of giving loans out to belligerents. They start to open up trade relationships with both sides of this conflict. So the new plan was to do trade both with the Allied powers and with Germany. Germany being our only really big trade partner in the Central Alliance. Italy, Austria, Hungary, they didn't mean much to the United States, but Germany did. We had a lot of business with them. But the United States tends to favor a stronger trade relationship with England. And they end up, even though they say they're going to be neutral, they're going to do business with both sides, they end up reducing the amount of trade that they do with Germany to about 1% of what it was before the war. So in all reality, they cut ties with Germany. Now, America, in terms of the people, the general populace, they are sort of split as to who we ought to be siding with in this war. America has obviously very strong linguistic and cultural ties with England. We speak English. We are started as a bunch of British colonies. We celebrate the same holidays for the most part. There's a lot of commonality. And ever since the War of 1812, the United States and England have enjoyed a very, very good relationship. Now, there's another group of people in America, though, that say, no, they're not our allies. We should partner up with Germany. And those people are people who were recent immigrants to the United States. First, you had Germans. There are a lot of German immigrants, and obviously this extends to Austrian and Hungarian immigrants as well. So what we're looking at here is that the Germans and the Austrian Hungarians are naturally going to feel a kinship with their homes. And so they are ultimately going to say, no, we shouldn't be siding with England. England's got a bunch of, a lot of anti-Hunnic, what they call it, anti-Hunnic propaganda, anti-Germanic propaganda. But these German people living in the United States are basically saying, no, I don't want to side up with England here. My homeland's Germany. And then you also have a huge segment of immigrants who had recently arrived from Ireland. And the Irish are still colonized by England, and the Irish hate the English. And they've traditionally hated the English. So at any point in time, if you give an Irishman an option, do you want to cheer for this guy or for England? He's always going to go with the other guy. And so the Irish immigrants and the German immigrants, or the people who are of that kind of descent in the United States, were very much in favor of joining the Central Powers, or at least siding with them in the war. So those who felt a connection with Britain felt that Germany was committing, they were reading stories about war atrocities being committed by the German troops. German and Irish Americans look at that and they say, that's just British propaganda. That's not real. And so in 1915, things are going to get a little bit more difficult for the United States to navigate this ongoing issue. Britain ends up blockading all of the German ports that enter out into the Atlantic, and they added cotton and food to their contraband lists. Now, cotton was just about the last thing we were selling to Germany. Wilson says, basically, this is not cool. You don't get to tell us we can't do business with Germany. You are at war with them, but we're not. And so ultimately, the way they sort of smooth this over and start working towards a real alliance between Britain and the United States is the Prime Minister of England is going to agree to say, all right, America, whatever you lose during the war in terms of trade with Germany, we'll offset that. We'll pay you back after the war for that. And so that is how the United States is going to kind of smooth over their relationship with England in the build up to our entering the war. Germany, in response to Britain blockading their ports, decided to declare all of the waters surrounding Britain a war zone. And what that means in terms of public policy, in terms of international diplomacy, is by calling it a war zone, it doesn't matter who's sailing in it, they are subject to be shot down and sunk. So the Germans are also using a new bit of naval technology, something that they call the U-boat, or that's kind of their name for it, but they actually call it Das Boot. But this is a submarine, an early precursor of a submarine, and it's a very functional one that's very effective. These things are cruising under the Atlantic, and what they're saying basically is if we catch anybody in the waters, don't care who you are, around the British Isles, we're going to sink your ship. And so with America still trying to conduct business in the Atlantic, you can kind of see this. There's going to be a problem here between the United States and Germany. And this all comes to a head in 1915 with an event known as the sinking of the Lusitania. So the Lusitania is a British passenger ship, but it's carrying 128 American citizens right off the coast of Ireland in May of 1915. At this point, when they're off the coast of Ireland, they were going on a path between England and New York in the United States. The Lusitania is off the coast of Ireland when it gets hit by torpedoes from a German U-boat. Now, the Germans say that they had warned U.S. travelers and that the Lusitania was not actually a passenger boat, that it was carrying ammunition to support the British war effort. So, in other words, the Germans said, hey, look, we told you that's a war zone. Don't come there if you don't want to get sunk. And in addition to that, they said, we don't even believe that was just a passenger ship. You guys, this is being used to supply the British. So Wilson is, in response, going to redefine what it means to be neutral in the build up to this war. He basically makes this very, very loud and clear message to the rest of the world. Americans will go where we want to go, when we want to go there, and we will do business with any neutral nation we want to. And so he also goes out to the Germans and he says, look, you're going to pay for what you did. You're going to pay us back for the sinking of the boat. You're going to pay the family members, the people who lost somebody on the Lusitania. And then on top of that, you are going to give Americans safe passage across the Atlantic. You will not touch our people on the Atlantic. Germany goes, nope, we're not doing that. They refuse that deal. So this redefinition of neutrality upsets a lot of people in the United States. Specifically, William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, he resigns. He actually says, that's it, I quit my job because you just put us on an absolute crash course into war with Germany. And the American people don't really want to, like I said, their attitude towards this war is it's a European problem. Let them work it out. And so in 1916, after this problem with the Lusitania and the back and forth between the U.S. and Germany, the United States will very controversially expand what it calls its peacetime army. In other words, we're getting prepped to enter into the war. And during the 1916 election, Wilson is going to run on the slogans that he kept us out of the war and peace with honor, in reference to securing what's known as the Arabic Pledge. This is another attempt to get Germany to agree not to attack U.S. passengers when they're traveling over the Atlantic without warning, but it's a pledge that they're going to break pretty much in May of 1916, so that they only got a few months into it. But Wilson is successful at capitalizing on the fact that America, we're inching towards war, but we're not at war yet. So he's able to sort of catapult that into another sort of presidential term. He says basically, look, you didn't want to go to war, I kept you out of war, and we're still doing business with people around the world. So we're going to have a bit of an issue here between America, Germany, and Mexico, as the United States keeps getting sort of egged on into this global conflict. Now, since the Roosevelt corollary, the Western Hemisphere, as we've learned about, was firmly under the control of the U.S. They're under their sphere of influence. But Germany is looking at the buildup of this peacetime army. They keep breaking their deals with us about protecting our citizens on the high seas. So long story short, Germany can see the writing on the wall and they go, yeah, America's not happy with us. And if they do join this war, they're not going to join on our side. They're going to be on the other side. So they are going to continue attacking passenger ships in the Atlantic, upsetting Americans. And then in addition to that, they start funding Mexican rebel groups. In particular, they fund a group that's headed by a guy named Francisco Pancho Villa. Villa's plan. Villa has this plan. Basically, he's anti-government. He doesn't like the Mexican government that's being led by a guy named Venustiano. Venustiano Carranza. So Venustiano Carranza, he's backed up by the U.S. government. He's allies with the U.S. And Germany is going to start funding people like Pancho Villa, who goes and attacks U.S. border towns. Basically, what Villa was trying to do was get the United States and Mexico to break off this alliance, so that no longer be partners. Now, after some border skirmishes, Wilson realizes that it's really the U.S. who started the hostilities with Mexico here, rather than the other way around. So he decides not to pursue a war there, and he pulls back troops from the border of Mexico and returns to diplomacy. But this is when a major bombshell hits. Germany goes back to their unrestricted activities in the Atlantic in 1917. And this is when Britain is going to intercept something known as the Zimmermann telegram. This was a note that was sent from Arthur Zimmermann, who is Germany's foreign minister to Mexico. In this letter, this is what's basically being said. Germany is sending this, and they're saying to Mexico, hey, look, if you go and start a war with the United States right now, we will send you support, we'll send you troops, we'll send you weapons, we'll send whatever you need, but we're going to help you recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Basically, what they're saying is, we'll help you attack the United States and get back what you lost in the Mexican-American War. Some 70-odd years earlier, or right around there. And so that's what Germany is proposing. The Zimmermann telegram goes a little wider. They actually reach out to Japan as well, and they say to Japan, "Hey, I know you're in this war on the other side, but look, you should join up with us." Because ultimately what we can do is offer you the west coast of the United States. You're a growing imperial power. We'll help you take California and the Pacific Northwest. Germany is not going to have any success. Nobody bites on this deal. But this telegram is intercepted, decoded, and it's published all over the world. When this comes to light, President Wilson immediately breaks all ties with Germany. He says we have no more trade relationship. We don't even have an open diplomatic relationship. So he still does not declare war on Germany or Mexico for what's happening with the Zimmermann telegram. But this is going to be sort of what pushes the United States towards entering this war. So, as all this is playing out, we're having some of these, I guess what you could call domestic issues in the United States. Russia, who's right in the middle of the Eastern Front in this war, they are going to collapse in a communist revolution, in case you're unfamiliar with this. In April of 1917, Woodrow Wilson formally approaches Congress and he secures a declaration of war against Germany. Now, this is important. This is an important distinction. At no point in time was the United States ever officially at war with the Ottoman Empire. We weren't at war with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And this shows you how Americans are thinking about this. I don't care what happened in Central Europe. I don't care about Franz Ferdinand. I don't care about Serbia or Yugoslavian nationalism. None of that matters to Americans. They don't care. What they do care about is Germans attacking them on the Atlantic. So when we declare war, we go strictly after Germany. Now, in 1917, in February, Tsarist Russia, which is the Tsar is the emperor of Russia, Tsarist Russia will collapse in a revolution. Now, the Tsarist regime would temporarily be replaced by a parliament, but in November of 1917, not many months afterwards, this parliamentary regime is going to be removed by Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution. This is where Lenin and his communist allies are going to overthrow the Russian government. And what they do here is important because it's going to lead to an ongoing series of problems, not just between Germany and Russia, but also Russia and the United States. I mean, this is the origins of the Cold War, if you want to think of it that way. After the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia is now a communist state. So here's the problem for the Allies. Russia doesn't just, now Russia's at war with itself. It has a revolution. They can't rightly stay in World War I. They're not going to be able to do that. And so they immediately withdraw from the Allied powers. They say, that's it. We had a revolution. We're out. Lenin comes in and says, I want nothing to do with France. I want nothing to do with England. And he doesn't just pull out of the alliance. He goes a step further. And he starts publishing Allied treaties and letters and communications. And so in a lot of ways, Russia didn't just pull out of the Allied powers. They didn't just leave and sort of defect on their duties in the war. They also went a step further and tried to damage the Allied powers that they had just left in terms of their reputation. Now, here's the biggest problem for the United States. In those Allied treaties and communications, basically there is one message back and forth between France and Great Britain. And they are looking towards the end of the war, and they're saying basically this. When this is over, if we've won, we need to figure out how to divvy up the land between that Germany holds all over the rest of the world. We need to figure out how to take their colonial holdings for ourselves and how we want to split those up. This is a problem for Woodrow Wilson and for the United States because we enter into this war, and Wilson has all these high-minded ideals. He says we're doing it for the sake of peace, and we're doing it for the sake of democracy. But when these letters get published, it becomes very clear that this isn't about peace and it's not about democracy. It's like every other war in world history. It's about resources. It's about power. It's basically a big land grab. And so the publication of these letters and these treaties after the Bolshevik Revolution is very, very damaging for Woodrow Wilson because he's standing there saying, we're doing it for democracy and peace. Well, his partners in the war are doing it to split up somebody else's land and take more colonial territory. So to deal with this kind of incongruity, to deal with this emerging problem, Woodrow Wilson is going to issue what he calls his 14-point plan. The 14 points plan it envisions an Allied victory. It's basically saying, we're going to win this war, and at the end of it, this is what we see the world looking like. And he has all these high-minded goals. He says every nation in the world will become a democracy with free trade. They're all going to disarm. Every person in every society is going to have self-determination. And conflict resolution should happen not through warfare, but through what he calls a League of Nations. And this is going to be like a forerunner to the United Nations. This is going to be developed after World War II, and it's designed to be a global peacekeeping organization and a mediator that can keep arguing nations out of war with one another. Robert Lansing, who was William Jennings Bryan's replacement as the Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, he looks at Wilson's plan and he goes, it's a joke. It's a pipe dream. Basically what Wilson's talking about is we're all going to hug and sing Kumbaya around the campfire and hold hands and sing and everyone's going to be friends. And it's not realistic. Everyone knows this is not how the world works. But that's how he's trying to pitch this idea of the 14 points plan in the League of Nations. And even his own people think this is ridiculous. But in response to the 14 points plan and the proposed League of Nations, Lenin is going to secure a peace treaty with the Central Powers. He knows that he's exposed. He can't fight Germany, and Germany is very likely to just roll in and take Russia if something isn't done. So he will conclude what is known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. That one's always a bit of a mouthful for me. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty. I'll never get it. Anyway, that is signed in 1918. What this does is basically this is a concession on the part of the Russians. The Russians are saying, ooh, we don't want Germany to invade us and attack us. They're scared. They're scared of Germany. So they say, here's the deal. If you promise not to come and attack Russia proper, we'll give you a whole big part of our Eastern Empire. We'll give you what today we would call Poland, the Ukraine, Finland, Latvia, Estonia. This all belonged to Tsarist Russia, and Lenin just hands it over to Germany. And he says, here, you can have all this land if you promise not to attack us. And so that's how Russia is going to exit the war. A rather inglorious and not exactly an honorable exit for the Russians. But that is the first action of the communist government there in Russia, is to pull out of World War I, hand over a bunch of land to Germany in return for the promise that Germany won't attack and hurt them. So the war comes to an end in 1918, and this is pretty much because America sat on the sidelines throughout the first 3 years of the war. America is going to bring fresh blood into a war that had devastated Europe. So the Allies are going to start to make considerable ground and naval gains throughout 1917 and 1918 once America has entered the war. So just imagine you've had all these other European powers have been killing each other, burning each other's cities down, wasting time, wasting money, wasting resources on this war. And then all of a sudden, America just kind of pops in right at the tail end. And from an American perspective, it's strategically very intelligent. We don't lose that many people. We don't really suffer the sacrifice of the war, but we are on the side that wins. And really, without the United States entering when they did, it's unlikely that an Allied victory would have come as soon as it did in November of 1918. The Allied forces are going to be in November of 1918. They're successful at driving Germany back into its own territory, and this is going to be what brings World War I to a close. The Allied side is victorious. The Central Powers are defeated. Now, there are what we call the Big Four. These are the leaders of the four largest Allied powers when the war comes to an end. This is Woodrow Wilson from the United States, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of the UK, a guy named Georges Clemenceau, who is the Premier of France, and Vittorio Orlando, who is the Premier of Italy. So those four countries get together, and they are going to try to come up with how this war will come to an end. They meet in Paris for a peace conference. And they're going to end up signing what is known as the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. That's when the treaty goes into effect. It's actually ratified a little, in other nations, it's ratified in 1918. But in the United States, the Treaty of Versailles is something that we're going to have a considerable amount of debate about. And ultimately, the United States is a little skeptical about some of the conditions of it. But Germany is going to suffer mightily at the end of this war. The Treaty of Versailles is going to punish Germany and Germany alone. They are going to be forced to pay reparations for damage done to every nation during the war. And then in addition to that, Germany is going to be completely disarmed under the treaty. They take all of their weapons and anything that can be used to produce weapons out of the country. Now, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany is essentially being asked to pay something like $30 billion in reparations to people around Europe for what they did during the war. They don't have $30 billion. Nobody's got $30 billion to give up in terms of paying a wartime reparation. And so this is considered probably, when you have the benefit of historical hindsight, when you can look back on something, this is considered one of the worst moves that the Western world had made in this time period. Essentially, by forcing an already broken and defeated Germany to pay $30 billion in reparations, we were guaranteeing the rise of a guy like Hitler and the Nazi Party. Now, in addition to punishing the Germans, anybody who signed into and ratified the Treaty of Versailles automatically agreed to participate in the League of Nations. This, again, is a collective security organization that's designed to mediate future global disputes. It's like a forerunner of the United Nations. But the easiest way to think about the League of Nations in terms of the cause and effect pattern here is it is designed to stop another war like World War I from happening. That is what the League of Nations is there to do, is to not allow these small little local problems to turn into global wars. The conditions of this treaty left Germany totally destabilized and economically destitute. Their overseas colonies are taken by Germany and France, just like Lenin said they would be, and divided up amongst the two of them. And this is going to create some really horrible conditions for Germany in the 1920s and going into the 1930s. Now, that leaves the United States with the issue of the Treaty of Versailles. This becomes a major issue in the U.S. basically what the concern here is we join the League of Nations. Then if one country attacks another country in Europe, we have to dedicate our military to helping them solve that problem by way of the League of Nations. And Americans don't like the idea that Americans don't want to be a part of a collective defense organization. Not at this time in the history of the United States. Their attitude is every time one European spits on another European, we're going to have to be loading up troops and heading over there and fighting wars all the time. And so the most outspoken opponent of the Treaty of Versailles is a senator named Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. But he is going to be a real thorn in Woodrow Wilson's side. Remember, Wilson, the President of the United States, is the one who came up with the League of Nations. It's his idea. And he is having a hard time getting Americans to buy into it. He actually goes around, he's working so hard trying to get this treaty ratified. He's going out and speaking to Americans all over the country and saying, we need this, we need this. Yes, we have to be a part of the League of Nations. He works so hard trying to do this that he actually suffers from exhaustion and has a stroke. And it leaves him partially paralyzed. So pretty much for the rest of his presidency, he is out of commission. He's not really an active player for the rest of his presidency. He's locked up and retreated from public view. So the U.S. will ultimately reject the Treaty of Versailles. The Senate doesn't sign off on this. But by 1921, the United States had negotiated its own peace treaties with Germany and then the nations which have now split. It's no longer the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's after World War I that Austria and Hungary split into two different countries. Now, again, I have to go back to the point that the U.S. was never technically at war with the Ottoman Empire or Bulgaria, so we don't need anything with them. But Woodrow Wilson is going to die in 1924. And when he does, the United States will not have joined the League of Nations. So he dies never seeing his real dream come to fruition. He dies with the Americans sort of rejecting this idea of signing into a collective defense organization. So in addition to that, the Treaty of Versailles is widely recognized by historians as being one of the main factors of what is going to sort of drive the Germans into electing Hitler in the Nazi Party in 1932 when that happens. So there is also, in the rest of our lecture, I talk a lot about on the PowerPoint slides, you'll see me talking about the Spanish flu. This obviously has been brought up a lot with the ongoing pandemic that we've seen here, but in 1918, we're seeing that this deadly new form of flu emerges and starts to ravage the world's population. The flu is first reported by Spanish doctors, but it's likely, and we don't know for certain, but epidemiologists and people who have traced the spread of this flu generally take it back to the American Midwest. That's where they think it started from or originated. But it was brought to Europe into the war front by U.S. troops. And it spreads there really, really readily. It spreads there really easily because in Africa and Asia too, because these are sites of war. People are living in clustered together spaces. Sanitary conditions aren't good. There's a lot of open wounds, a lot of problems. The disease spreads really, really quickly there. Once it's in Europe, it's going to start to spread everywhere else. Remember, you have colonial troops coming back home. So somebody from Nigeria might pick it up in Europe and then move back to Nigeria. And now it's spreading around in West Africa as well. So when you do some final accounting, there are nearly 25 million Americans are going to catch this flu, and about 675,000 are going to die. On a global scale, 500 million catch it and 100 million die. By comparison, World War I only killed 9 million soldiers and 7 million civilians. Now, I don't want to be flippant and say that a grand total of 16 million people dead is no big deal. But you can see here that you're talking about 16 million, and the lowest conservative estimate for the Spanish flu is that it killed 50 million. And so that is definitely something that's going to have a wide-reaching and long-lasting impact on the world and the United States. Here in the U.S., it tends to spread mostly around the big urban centers like Detroit, Chicago, Indianapolis, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, New York, Boston, all those places. But the areas of the world that it spreads most sort of rampantly to is the developing nations that have been colonized by Europe. Places like India get it very, very bad. Nigeria gets it very, very bad. West Africa in general. And the other problem there is since they're colonies, you have this issue where the treatment for the Spanish flu and readily available medicines and treatments are not going to be something that the colonies are going to be able to afford. The imperial powers are trying to take care of their own people back home. They're not paying to take care of their colonial citizens. So I'm just up at about an hour now. So I'm going to wrap up there, but I do want you to take a look through the rest of the PowerPoint lecture. There's some very, very important stuff going on during World War I. And a lot of it ties into what's happening in World War I, namely prohibition and suffrage, female suffrage in the United States. We're going to see the suffragist movement really, they zero in on World War I, and I'm going to kind of do the quick and dirty for you here. There's a sharp rise in anti-German and anti-Hunnic sentiment here in the United States when this all happens in World War I. In fact, many German speakers, and this is true of my family, as we have one part of my family who was German, and they all spoke German in the home up until World War I, at which point the parents told the kids, knock that German stuff off, because if you're out in public speaking German during World War I, somebody's going to beat you. There's cases of tarring and feathering, people getting killed just because they are of German descent. And so you can see that Americans don't react real well. The propaganda machine gets going, and you have a lot of anti-German sentiment when the war breaks out. So we're seeing the war is responsible for that. It's responsible for the flu being spread around the globe. And also, in a lot of ways, women are capitalizing off of this in order to get access to voting rights on a national scale. What they're going to do is, there's a couple of different types of suffragist organization here. There's the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and that's the more conservative end of the suffragist movement. They are basically, and their sort of rhetoric tends to win out. What they're going to say, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they go, look, you've got tons of Germans in this country, and you got the Irish who don't like the British, so they're tacitly supporting the Germans. You got a lot of Central Europeans in this country. And now, after you've had the fall of Russia to communism, you have the threat of anarchy, socialism, and communism spreading in. And to explain, they've been talking a lot about what socialism means to your generation and the younger generation. For most of American history, socialism is a dirty word. It's not something that it's seen as basically blasphemy to the American way of life. The American attitude towards economics and government is that you leave me alone and I work hard and I make what I earn, and that's about it. And everybody else can get away from me and not tell me what to do. But there is this real fear that if we continue to have Eastern European immigrants coming in, they're going to be bringing communist and socialist and anarchist ideas with them. And so the suffragist movement, they zero in on this and they go, look, who would you rather have voting? And a good old American woman born in the Midwest on a farm who cares about nothing more than the well-being of this country? Or do you want some German guy coming in and getting citizenship and voting? And so they kind of capitalize on the anti-German sentiment in World War I, and that is how women are going to really get a lot of clout moving in the direction of passing the 19th Amendment. Woodrow Wilson, a progressive president as well, part of this larger progressive movement that we see coming out in the early 20th century. He is going to spearhead the call for women's suffrage, and Congress will pass the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women's voting rights on a federal level. And so that will be ratified in 1920. So in a lot of ways, women's suffrage is tied up to the war. So is another issue that comes at this time, and that is prohibition. And I'll leave you to read about that. But they'll pass the 18th Amendment in 1917 to ban alcohol in the United States. You can't sell it, manufacture it, transport it, anything. Now, this is wholly unenforceable. That's the biggest problem with prohibition in the United States. The 18th Amendment says you can't do any of these things, but the problem is Congress doesn't put any money towards prohibition. And so all that happens is you create a black market for alcohol in the United States. But they're going to capitalize again on the people who want to see alcohol outlawed, the temperance movement. They're going to capitalize on World War I too, because they're going to say, hey, look, here's what's going on. Germans are beer brewers, and they're our enemy right now. And so they actually capitalize on this, and they say, if you really want to be able to support the Germans, then you're in favor of drinking. And so if you're in favor of prohibition, then you must be anti-German, and you must be in support of our war effort. And so a lot of these real weird sorts of things we're seeing happen, I shouldn't say weird, I should say unique things that we see happening at this time period are tied directly to the war and anti-German propaganda. Now, in 1933, ultimately in the midst of the Great Depression, the United States Congress is going to have to pass the 21st Amendment, which completely undoes the 18th Amendment. So prohibition's a rather short-lived experiment in the United States. So in addition to that, I talk in my lecture about the Immigration Act of 1924 and basically how this relates to the first Red Scare. As I mentioned, the United States is very, very leery of Eastern European people. They are really widely known because you do have to understand to a certain degree why socialism and communism scare Americans in this period, particularly communism, but also socialism because it's part of the exact same spectrum. But what communism actually says is it doesn't just say, hey, we've got this new system, we're going to set it up in this way, and this is how our society is going to work, and it's a good political system for us. It doesn't say that. Communism says communism is the solution to the failures of capitalism. And communism hasn't actually achieved its goal until capitalism has been destroyed on a global scale. So in other words, what communists like Lenin are saying, and then after him, you'll have other guys come out and sort of spearhead the movement. You'll have guys like Stalin, and then eventually we get to Khrushchev and all those guys. But they come right out and they say they're not shy about it. They say if you're in a capitalist Western nation, you need to die. You need to go. That's it. You should have your entire government overthrown, and you should have a revolution like we have here in Russia. And what the communist government wouldn't really capitalize on or tell people about is the fact that they summarily lined up all the wealthy people in Russia, killed them outside of their own homes, shot them dead in the street without trial or jury, basically accused them of being nothing but rich. You got killed for being rich. And then that same communist government took all the money, and it never made its way back to the people. And so what you're seeing here is that this is what America is afraid of. If you let unchecked immigration come in from Eastern and Southern Europe, you're going to allow communism to come in, and communism's whole goal is to destroy the capitalist system of the United States. And so this is what leads into the first Red Scare in 1919 and 1920. The government then is going to monitor, arrest, and deport any suspected communist sympathizers, or anarchists living in the United States. This is kind of really widely reflected in the case of Sacco and Vanzetti. You have kind of a witch hunt going on here for anybody who comes from Southern or Eastern Europe, but it will all result in the Immigration Act of 1924. What this act says is it says, anybody in the Western Hemisphere can come on into the United States unrestricted. You're free. So if you're living in Mexico, come on in. If you're living in Puerto Rico, come on in. If you're living anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, the United States is open to you. However, it bans all Asian immigrants. Nobody's allowed to come from Asia anymore at all. And then it starts setting specific quotas for European countries. And they do it this way because they say, I'm going to set a really high quota for British people, because they don't have anarchists and communists. They're going to send over decent, hardworking people. However, I'm going to set a very small number for Russia, knowing that they're going to send over people who want to destroy my government. And that's the way that the United States is looking at this during the first Red Scare, and that's their major concern. So there's also some conversation about the Scopes monkey trial and fundamentalism during modernists or fundamentalist versus modernists during the 1920s. Marcus Garvey and Pan-Africanism, myself being an Africanist and knowing about this back to Africa connection, you definitely want to zero in on that. And if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. The Harlem Renaissance, women and the new woman and the women's movement kind of responding to voting. So Margaret Sanger and the Planned Parenthood. There's a lot going on in this week's reading and lecture. Unfortunately, all I have time for is to kind of work you through World War I, but definitely take a look through what's going on in that lecture slide. The last thing I am going to talk about, though, because it's going to be something I have to pick up on immediately when we get into the Great Depression, is this economic scheme that's set up in the 1920s, and that's going to lead to a major, major problem on a global scale. So when we get to the end of World War I, Europe owes America about $10 billion in wartime debts for equipment and supplies sold. And when I say Europe, I'm talking about primarily England and France. We know we're not going to get any money from Russia because they now are very, very anti-capitalist, having established their communist government. But Europeans, like anybody else who's staring a $10 billion bill in the face, probably they don't want to pay it. And what they start saying is they say to the United States, hey, you need to forgive our debts because what we gave and what the United States gave into this war effort and money, Europeans paid in blood. Now, that is just something that the United States is not going to accept. No, you're not going to go ahead and just default on your loans to us. You owe us the money. I don't care what you think you paid. You still owe us the money. But in order to pay the United States back, Europe needed to get money from Germany first. Germany owes $33 billion in reparations after the Versailles Treaty. And so what happens here is that France and England owe the United States, but Germany owes France and England. So Germany has to pay first in order for those nations to then pay back the United States. And when Germany misses a payment, it threatens to undermine Europe's entire economy. The Allied powers rely on that German reparation payment, but at the end of the day, the Germans just don't have the money. This is when a banker from Chicago gets involved, a guy by the name of Charles Dawes. And he concocts what's known as the Dawes Plan in 1924. The idea is that it was supposed to stabilize Germany, although if I'm being really, really honest with you, even as a historian, I don't understand how nobody saw this as a major problem in the first place. But this is what happens. The United States is going to float a loan to Germany on a regular basis of about $200 million. And so the United States basically props Germany up. Then Germany is supposed to take that money and pay France and England back. And then France and England would pay the money to the United States. Now think about this and go to the graphic on the PowerPoint slide. America loans the money to Germany, who pays it back to France and Britain in reparations, who then pays that money back to war loans from to the United States. So in other words, the United States is paying itself back. Germany doesn't have the money, so we're just giving the money to Germany, and then Germany's giving it to France and Britain, and then they're giving it back to us. So the money's just going around in a big circle. We haven't really fixed anything. All we've done is just taken some money, and what it does do is it calms tensions down. As long as Germany is making their payments, they have less to worry about from France, who might just invade and start trying to take stuff back because they're not getting paid. So it does settle down the political climate in Europe. But what it does is it innately ties now Europe's banking system and, by extension, the banking system of all of those colonies that we were talking about at the outset of this lecture. They're all now tied to the United States. That might not be a big problem if the United States doesn't have a massive stock market collapse in 1929, which, spoiler alert, yes, they are going to have. So when the United States economy collapses, the whole global economy comes with it. So I'm now stealing my own thunder. I've got to wrap this thing up, but that's our video lecture for this week. Just remember this economic scheme when we get into our next topic, which is going to be the Great Depression. So that wraps it up for me. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, as usual, feel free to email me at davyj@uhd.edu. Have a good one.